A little bit of introduction. I mentioned right now I'm representing Fadu. I'm the Senior Director of Product Planning. Most of my day job involves, like right now, planning our PCIe Gen 6 NVMe SSD. So working with hyperscalers, OEMs, and our NAND partners to kind of look at the requirements and strategy there. I am, as we mentioned, a longtime industry standard guy. I co-chair a 501c6 nonprofit called Circular Drive Initiative. So I'm the Secretary and Treasurer. That's completely outside of Fadu. I spent 10 years at Intel doing SSD stuff, so I was there between 2011 and 2021, if you guys remember, the very first NVMe drive, P3700. So I ran the validation program for that, and I took over as product manager when that launched in 2014. And then I ran the product line marketing, product line strategy, and strat planning for the Intel NVMe SSDs, from then until 2021 when Intel sold us off to SK Hynix. And I actually left right before the acquisition, which is now Solidigm. They're good friends of mine, but I left right around when they transitioned. Went to a company called Chia. So I was a VP of storage at Chia. Chia is a blockchain company about storage, and so I'm still doing some blockchain stuff, and I have a couple AI startups. But it's been really, really fun to dig right back in, go very, very deep into the SSD world. Not much has changed, honestly. Leaving for 3 years, I didn't really leave, but I was still doing lots of storage stuff on the side with WD and Seagate and whatnot. But it's surprising how much some stuff changes, some stuff does not. So I'm going to give you guys a quick introduction of just Fadu, the company, what we do, our current product roadmap, which is kind of more important, and the business models we have. And then I'm sure you want to hear, okay, why are you guys different than everybody else? A little bit about PCIe Gen 5 SSD. One of the things that we are going to talk a lot about is power efficiency.
Slow down.
Oh yeah, I have one speed, and it's very fast.
No. There's so much information that you're going to share.
Yeah.
Give us a chance to process it. Thank you.
Don't talk like that for 90 minutes.
I will. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, and then the exciting thing, we actually are okay now to share a little bit of information on the PCIe Gen 6 SSD, which was a little hard because it's still pretty early in the we're just getting started with the design phase. But I thought we'd kind of give you a little bit of brief of what goes into designing a PCIe Gen 6 SSD and how we're thinking about that.
I hope power efficiency is top of your list.
Yes, for sure. And that's
speak up, please.
Yes, the power efficiency right now is one of the largest differentiators for the Fadu product. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time kind of describing how I think about that, how we think about that in the controller design. And then one of the most exciting features in NVMe for us has been flexible data placement. So this is a brand new feature that's been kind of pushed by Meta and Google and other hyperscalers to fix the WAF issue, and I'll talk all about that. So from a company perspective, Fadu is a Korean company. There is an office in the U.S. that has about 10 of us. Most of the important work happens in Korea. We have the VP of marketing and the VP of sales that are in the U.S. and myself. Obviously, I do the product planning, but it is a Korean company, which is why some of you probably have never heard about Fadu. Which is how I ended up at the company is another story for some drinks later. But it's traditionally just been an eSSD company, so enterprise SSDs from the start. We talked through some of the technology. The founder Peter Nam and then Jiho, there's two, and DK are the three founders. He wrote. There's like over 150 papers, academic papers on SSD technology between like the 2009 and 2014 period. And three of those key papers were kind of key in the Fadu architecture that got them to decide to go after this enterprise SSD market. So even 2023 was like an absolutely abysmal year for SSDs. If it's kind of hard to remember before this AI boom that like everybody was struggling. All the SSD companies were struggling very bad in 2023. So somehow Fadu got an IPO out in Korea. Raised $150 million on $1 billion valuation. I barely know how to check the Korean stock exchange, so but we are listed in a public company in Korea. Right now we have 3 generations shipping of PCIe SSDs, so the Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the Gen 5, which is what we're kind of shipping this year and launching at scale, and then the Gen 6 stuff, which I'm planning to be shipping into the end of next year and early 2026. The NAND vendors that we work with, So we support basically all the NAND vendors on the controller, but the two that we work with most closely right now are Western Digital and SK Hynix. And I'll talk quite a bit more about those relationships as they're very key to a very important, very major hyperscaler.
Western Digital who, please?
SK Hynix. Yes, and this is too small for you guys to see, but it's kind of just a history and timeline. The most important thing is I mentioned, if you guys recall, that the very first NVMe SSD was 2014. That was P3700. I mentioned I was the product manager, and so by the time Fadu came out with the first they had the POC in around 2016, 2017. The very first Gen 3 SSD was like kind of in 2017. If folks remember, that was also kind of a weird time in the NAND market. 2016 went from oversupply back to 2017 undersupply very, very quickly. It was one of the kind of similar to what happened in the last 3 or 4 quarters. But it was kind of late in the Gen 3 cycle. But when they launched, the drive was like 80% better in performance and performance per watt and sequential write performance. It was mountains over the stuff that Intel had and Samsung had. Remember, at that time frame, there was two SSD vendors in NVMe. It was Intel and Samsung. There was nobody else. There was 100% of the market share was just Intel and Samsung. So they had this awesome drive, but it was kind of hard to wedge in, to this emerging market. And then, the Gen 4 controller was out in 2019 to 2021, and this development time frame. 2019, again, that's when Intel launched the Gen 4. There was also a lot of chaos around then with the Gen 4 transition. Intel had to shift the roadmap a couple times. They canceled Ice Lake, they put it back on. AMD announced Rome with Gen 4, and it kind of sped things up. But the Gen 4 adoption of SSDs didn't really happen until almost, really ramping until 2021. So the Gen 5 has been a lot more fun because, they were able to scale the microarchitecture, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about today, and launch it into the market with a large partner, which I mentioned is Western Digital. So, okay.
Any questions so far?
Yeah.
Will Fadu follow Phison to making its own SSDs?
Yeah, we're going to get that. We have a business model page here about that, and just so for the folks that
did you ever have plans to make computational storage devices?
We have looked into computational storage. I can give you my unbiased opinion as a strategic planner about computational storage, but I don't think. I think it's an interesting experiment, but I don't think it's something that you can ship in production at scale. There's a couple. I did write a blog for ScaleFlux back when I was independent, so I can talk a little bit about compression and stuff if you guys have some questions. But so the main, obviously we have the main business was SSD controllers, but we actually have a turnkey SSD business too. So there's really just two businesses right now. There's controller business and SSD business. And the big difference between, Chris mentioned, like a Phison or SMI, those guys traditionally have this white label, model for SSDs where they do the SSD controller, they do the board design, they do the firmware, they basically do all the work, the validation, RDT, they actually even do the manufacturing. And then if you want to make a drive, like all these like random vendors, they just say, okay, tell us what you want on the label for $150. They'll print you a label and you have your own SKU. So nobody's been able to actually successfully do that in the enterprise space. So these, my litmus test of like how you're able to deploy a white label drive into the enterprise is, have you passed a hyperscale qual? So some of the folks you mentioned that have consumer SSDs but are trying to get into the enterprise SSD market, they've never successfully completed an enterprise or hyperscale qual. And that's a big deal, right? You can make a drive that looks like an enterprise drive and has all the right NAND and the right features and stuff, but until you get through a hyperscale qual, you are not an enterprise SSD vendor. And that's very hard, for a lot of folks to understand. But so the model is easy, right? So the controller business, I mentioned one of the next slide kind of articulates, kind of that, which is like to build your own SSD. We give you some reference firmware and a controller, and highly customized. If some folks want to build their own board or do some of their own validation RDT, that would be that. A turnkey one is where we actually do the entire SSD. So we do SSDs on all 3 form factors, so U.2, E1.S, and E3. So that's the turnkey design is basically a full SSD ready to be shipped into production. And
you don't sell your SSDs to enterprises.
Yeah, not directly. So, and that's where this is kind of like I had to we had a bunch of logos on this slide. I had to remove them, because I was probably not. They probably don't want to see the logos. But you might know like Smart Modular is one of the vendors we work with. They ship through to Lenovo, and that's just Smart Modular is just a Fadu drive. Swissbit. I mean, I think they're in the EU as well.
I'm confused. Do you sell branded Fadu drives?
We do, but it's not really our core business. We have them, but we don't really market. We're not aggressively marketing or
So you
selling.
probably don't. I'm guessing that's. So you make drives for other people that rebrand them as theirs.
That's the number one business model for the turnkey, right? So I mentioned the two that you might come to mind in EU, like Swissbit and Smart Modular. Obviously the biggest ones are the one where we have a kind of combo model where we did the reference design, and then they took it into a model where they did their own board design and kind of customized some of the things on top of the firmware. That's this next slide, which is, I'll kind of go back to this in a sec, but WD is our biggest partner. So the WD SNA61, this is their flagship Gen 5 drive across all the different Gen 5 compute segments. So for AI, for high performance enterprise storage, it was the first drive to actually complete the NVIDIA certification for AI. So WD is the example of the big example of our NAND customer who is taking our controller, our reference firmware, and then making their own board. They do kind of their own RDT and kind of split the validation between us and them, and then they ship it as an end product. They do all the sales. They obviously make the NAND, right? We don't have the NAND. That's the big six, and then they do all the support and full manufacturing of the drive.
So is that separate to Smart Modular, companies like Smart Modular and
Yeah,
Swissbit?
you got it.
They
So
buy
that
the whole damn thing off you.
exactly that one we actually buy the NAND and procure the NAND.
Right.
We actually go make it in our factory and then give it to them, and then they put the label on it and then they sell it. So that's the turnkey model versus and again, it's the same firmware, very similar firmware stack as what we're shipping to hyperscalers. So,
What's your typical balance of business between the two?
well, right now it's most all up here. I think here is where we're trying to figure out where do we play. The couple partners I mentioned it's been good to learn and go through some of these enterprise OEM quals, but the business is nowhere near as big as these hyperscalers, which I'll mention. Just these guys just drown out everybody else in the volume.
You don't have Kioxia on there.
No, so we do support Kioxia and Micron NAND, and this is kind of the partners that we're going through. So from the controller support, and I guess I should have clarified that the controller supports every vendor NAND. So it'll support SK Hynix, WD, and Kioxia NAND, the Solidigm NAND, and then Micron. So
But you're not shipping your controller. You don't have a controller supply deal with Kioxia as you do with Western Digital.
correct, yeah. So this is their WD is the WD and SK Hynix have drives in their portfolio that use the Fadu controller. So both of them, yeah. So the direct customers, we have one of Elon Musk's companies. We have a very, very specialized SKU for him, and in this direct customer thing, again, not mega volumes, but very, very kind of unique thing we can do. The direct, we have some direct sales through Dell India and some other, again, this is very, very small compared to the hyperscaler stuff. So
If I buy a Western Digital drive, will I see Fadu on the board somewhere?
it's funny. The name's on the controller. It's funny. We, for some reason, it's funny. I helped write this storage review article with Brian when they launched the SNA61. But it's funny. They wanted this was before they had the press release for Fadu and WD, and they're okay, we don't want to talk about who's doing the controller or whatever, WD. But yeah, you can if you look at the pictures, you'll see the FC 51. So
when you say a hyperscaler, is it a traditional definition of hyperscaler, or is it the number of drives somebody buys?
while I can't describe who our actual hyperscalers are, I can tell you that we have a great collaboration with Meta, and that Meta has co-presented with Fadu at the last 3 Flash Memory Summits. And they've been a very, very strong partner in E1.S, which I mentioned. I have kind of a long history on the Intel side of trying to get the hyperscalers to move off M.2 to E1.S. and a big proponent in supporting Fadu and flexible data placement. So Fadu was, I believe, the first or one of the first between us and Samsung to demonstrate a live demo of FDP. So let's say Meta has been extremely supportive, and you can imagine that this fictional hyperscaler that we ship to.
SSDs
Yeah. Through these guys. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I have one more question. You say Meta has been extremely supportive. It's you and everybody else, because every storage company out there has Meta as their reference. So again, how do you define extremely supportive?
Well, I can't.
I mean,
sure, yeah. Well, I can't.
Enterprise storage system providers. There was a presentation earlier on. Everybody quotes Meta as their prime and number one supporter, customer, whatever you want to call it. How are you defining extremely supportive?
I can tell you that the hyperscalers, like somebody like Microsoft Azure, I've worked with the procurement folks, and actually our VP of sales, used to be procurement at both Microsoft and Meta. Their job as a procurement person is to qualify everybody so they can get the best pricing. Mm-hmm. Meta has a different strategy. I can tell you just from the amount of resources they put on storage versus everything else, as far as like the number of vendors they can qualify, is not everyone. It's a handful of vendors for each volume shipment, and they're shipping tens to 20, tens of exabytes into this AI market. And yeah, all I can say is it's not every vendor. It's a handful of vendors. Probably two with like a backup as a third if the other guys can't ship.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. So that's about all I can say about our business deals. But we have the obvious one that we're kind of working on is you guys might have seen that ScaleFlux did an OCP announcement where they open sourced their BOM and the hardware designs. I can say we're working with Open Compute very, very closely on some very interesting stuff that we can't quite announce yet. But there's some stuff that we're going in that direction. All right. So honestly, the reason I joined Fadu was the tech. I hopped on the phone with our CTO Peter when I was kind of interviewing, and honestly, some of the questions I asked him about the controller and technology just blew my mind. Right? I thought I knew everything about SSD controllers. I was bigwig product manager from Intel. I know everything about SSDs, boy, he blew my mind with some of the controller. The stuff that they have is very, very, very interesting. So. I have some slides in the power efficiency stuff that will illustrate this in a graph later, but basically when you want to scale the performance in an SSD, traditionally you've had to just put more compute in there. And the compute in a typical, this is just a screenshot of the Marvell Bravera controller, which is their Gen 5, and you can see they have some Cortex M7s and R8s in there, they have ARM cores. And basically if you want to go from an 8-channel to a 16-channel controller, you basically have to double the ARM cores to double the performance. The microchip controller that's called Yorktown, that's their Gen 5 controller. I actually helped write the requirements for that controller when I was at Intel. And same thing, when they wanted to scale from Gen 4 to Gen 5, they basically had to double the ARM performance, right? By either going to a smaller litho, increasing the clock frequency. And so Fadu's architecture is very, very different. So there's 4 RISC-V cores, and these are just in the management plane. These are not in the data plane or hardware critical path. These are just kind of there for error recovery, error handling, kind of corner cases, and kind of managing and orchestrating the firmware. But all the magic happens in this programmable control plane. Whoop, as I knock this thing down here. So this programmable control plane here, can you see? Yes. Okay, so this is the really interesting part about the architecture. So this is where you take these NVMe commands and you pipeline them. You break them down into smaller. We have these things called PPUs, which I'm going to talk about the next page, which is this packet processing unit. And I'm going to go back here just to show you. So the control plane is where we take the NVMe commands and break them up and pipeline them into a bunch of smaller commands. And so we can execute them async and pipeline them to accelerate them and increase the bandwidth.
Did you steal this from Sony? With the cell processor.
The cell. Yeah, pipelining is not a new, it's not a new thing in computer architecture, I guess, but this is the first time it's been done with FTLs and SSDs. So there's a hardware acceleration layer, which obviously every SSD vendor has some more hardware acceleration, because if you don't, then if you do everything in firmware, you're going to be extremely high power. And so you have to have some hardware acceleration. I'll kind of talk through the trade-off here that Fadu made, but we have this control plane where you have these smaller microprocessors. These are also RISC-V cores, but they're 32-bit. So these are smaller. They're just regular embedded processors, but we can program them individually. And so this is really, really flexible when you start to talk about like scaling. When we scale, and this will really be apparent when I show you how we scale from Gen 5 to Gen 6. Every other SSD vendor had a really, really hard, really bad time scaling from Gen 5 to Gen 6. It was very easy for us. We took the exact same microarchitecture. It was very small amounts of changes we had to make. So the data plane is where all this stuff is 100% hardware offloaded, hardware accelerated. So the ECC engine, the RAID engine, the AES XTS for the encryption layer, that's all 100% hardware accelerated. So that's different than the hardware acceleration in the control plane that has its own SRAM that these little small embedded processors call when they pipeline the commands. Of course, every SSD controller has a PCIe, interface to the host, and then NAND channels to the NAND. That's not unique. And then the SRAM and the DRAM that kind of talk globally to the SSD. So the key message here is that, like, if you want to scale a typical SSD controller design, you have to just throw more cores at it. And with pipelining, you can do a lot more interesting stuff. You can just, instead of just throwing more stuff at it, you can break things down into smaller stages, and that significantly has an effect on power efficiency and quality
of
service.
We've got time to go over some of this again.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have time. We got 90 minutes.
When you say break up a command, how do you break up a command? If a command is
I really tried to. I tried to do my best to give an example of this was like my. So when you talk about pipelining, right? So you have this multi-stage pipeline where each command is handed by a bunch of these PPUs, and each PPU might call its own dedicated hardware offload. So in the Fadu controller, they have this flash acceleration layer, which basically just means they've hardware automated all the garbage collection, which is very, very challenging. But the reason why this is really interesting is that when you say you take an NVMe read, typically you just have firmware do all this stuff, and then maybe one or two of these things have some hardware offloads. But then, okay, well, what happens when you want to, hey, we just invented FTP. We have to actually change the command decoding because we have to figure out if the host is calling and tagging a write with FTP. Oh, you have a hardware automation block for that you didn't have that in there? Oh, you're screwed. You can't change your hardware. So instead, they have to go revert back to firmware where it's slow and power inefficient. So this is an example of an NVMe read where this read command actually gets broken up into 10 subcommands, and then it's pipelined. So each one passes the command to another. And as long as that time, the processing time, we'll just say it's like 100 units of time, as long as each one of them is under this 100 units of processing time, then you'll be able to have infinite scaling on these command flows.
So when you talk about hardware acceleration, you're talking about ASIC style.
Exactly, yeah. So and that's where I'll see if I can do my best to explain this in the next slide here.
Sorry, I don't know what other people.
Yeah, and this was really tough to.
It's just esoteric stuff.
Yeah, these were the hardest kind of slides I needed to think about because this is and the way that they describe it, that they were kind of whiteboarding it. I'll show you this, like the idea of flexibility versus power and performance efficiency. This is like curve. But yeah, the benefit of pipelining is you get increased throughput, which you'll see in performance and power efficiency is very scalable.
Can I just interrupt you here?
Yeah.
Okay, so I can see that the pipeline exists and that a read comes in and that's a pipeline for it. Another read comes in and the first one is partway through its pipeline. It's finished command fetch, so that command fetch unit is available. It seems to me there has to be some kind of scheduling entity which logs which units are busy and which are not, has an idea of the pipeline queue, and applies stages of the pipelines to PPUs. You've got to have some kind of control system.
Yeah, let me see if I can.
You've got to have
So basically, for an SSD, you're tuning to the max PCIe gen bandwidth, right? So for Gen 5, for us, that's 3.3 million IOPS, 14 or so gigabytes a second. So as long as you can execute all the commands and hit those IOPS numbers or read bandwidth numbers, then
what I'm getting at,
yeah.
it has to be some
Yeah.
kind of schedule.
Yeah, there is some duplication of so we can process.
That surely has a scalability limitation.
Yeah, so there's, especially in stuff I'll talk about FTP, where you have different open write streams, which means you have to actually have separate spots in your SRAM to accept new writes. Then you need separate, command structures. But we have, this is just an example, we have hundreds and hundreds of PPUs within the drive. So there is some duplication and orchestration between what we can, arrange. But yeah.
Given this is not like a CPU where you get lots of data dependencies, I take it you don't tend to get pipeline stalls and bubbles or anything.
Yeah, and this is why they call it the, the programmable control plane. God, sorry, blown up. Because just say for instance we scale to Gen 6, and this one is taking 150 unit time. We're supposed to be taking 100, and it's kind of slowing down the rest of the stuff. Well, we can actually just take that command and pipeline it again into two other people. Yeah, exactly. So we can get the scaling we need without having to go, oh man, we just had to blindly double the amount of cores and double the frequency, because that would just double the power. So we can actually be really, really tactical about, okay, that little subcommand is taking a little bit longer. We can split it up into two more commands. And yeah, so this, so there, this is like the very, very basic version. Obviously the CTO of Fadu and founder of Fadu, Peter, he has written a bunch of academic studies on this topic.
Can you give us the references to the papers?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What happens if some commands surely can't be split up? There must be some atomic commands in this.
So all these are just, when you look at an embedded processor, it's just C code being executed, right? So there's always stuff you can kind of look and say, how do we split this thing up into, two different being executed by two cores instead of one,
Okay, so if one of those things just happens to take a long time for some reason, and so the whole thing gets longer than your 100 milliseconds, you just get in there and split up one of the commands to make it take less time?
Yeah, it's not like so these are fixed, they're fixed in the firmware, and I guess I should say, this might be the only downside of this type of architecture is that once the firmware is done, it's actually very simple. But the initial writing of all that firmware, now, if they want to change one command or one thing, we can tweak one thing here and there. But obviously the big hurdle was getting the microarchitecture up and working. Yeah. But that was the one thing that was very, very surprising. So at Intel, every generation, from Gen 3 to Gen 4, it was we threw out 70% of the controller design, maybe more. From Gen 4 to Gen 5, it was throw out the whole thing, it doesn't work, right? For Fadu, from Gen 3 to Gen 4 to Gen 5, the microarchitecture is very, very similar. Besides the core scaling stuff, which is again, that just doesn't happen in SSD design. It's just that was another eye-opening thing for me. Yeah. Okay, so why does this matter? This is actually a graph I stole from Solidigm. So Chingru presented this at Flash Memory Summit, or Future Memory Storage, or whatever the hell it's called now, this year. But she actually did a great job of illustrating what I'm trying to say, which is if you have these kind of Gen 4 ASICs that are on the left here, you have power, and then incremental throughput. So basically, if you want more performance, you got to give it more power, and it's a linear curve. All SSDs work like this. And they have some sort of axis where they start at an idle power of 5 or whatever, right? So these lines are these ARM A-core based SSDs that were Gen 4, right? So it's very clear. If you want to double the performance to Gen 5, you can't just throw more ARM cores. You're going to be up here. It's going to be a 20-watt controller, and you have a U.2 that's 25 watts. Okay, now you're stuck. You need to go to the drawing board. What do we do? Okay, we'll just move to ARM R&M cores, and we'll go from 12 nanometer TSMC to 7. And we'll reduce the power by 40%, whatever. And that's these dotted line curves, right? Where you can kind of change the architecture a little bit by just throwing either better process technology or better ARM cores. And then on here you have the more where there's lots more hardware acceleration. I believe She didn't tell me, but I think these are the SK Hynix drives down here. Like the PS1010 is the new solid I'm one. So I don't have. I actually gave her a Fadu drive. I'm like, you should test it and see how where it lands. Since she's basically testing it right now, but it's down here on this curve, right? It's below even the hardware automation curve. And this pipelining is really, really interesting. So theoretically, if you were to hardware automate everything in the SSD, you'd be like the lowest power ever. But like, I don't know, like we worked with SSD firmware guys that had worked in GPUs and CPUs and embedded processors, and they're like, yeah, SSD firmware is like 1,000 times more complex than any domain. It makes sense, right? If you mess up, you lose the customer data, and that's like not acceptable. Like in a GPU or something, we had to like reset the card or whatever. It's not the end of the world, right? In SSDs, SSD firmware is really, really, really hard because of this idea where you can never, ever, ever lose the data. So if you have this, I just say conventional SSD. So you have kind of low hardware acceleration. Realistically, this is a graph, but I'm trying to overly simplify here.
What's the FW standing for in front of flash?
Firmware, yeah. So firmware flash translation layer. So this is like, okay, I mentioned if you wanted to just like, this is how SSDs, were like in Gen 3 and Gen 4. This is how it worked. You just want to scale the performance. You scale the ARM cores, and that worked for a long time until it didn't. So the flexibility is good. You want to do new features, so you can just code them in firmware. Great. But your pipeline, no. Power efficiency, really bad. And scalability performance, bad. I mentioned if you want to go from like Gen 4 to Gen 5, you have to redesign the whole thing every time. So RTL, hardware acceleration heavy. This means just like hardware automate everything. RTL, yeah. Like the hardware block.
Register translation.
Yeah, it's like the hardware. It's like the firmware for the hardware.
What does it stand for again?
Register translation.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Perfect. That's where my I ask Dr. ChatGPT here. RTL is like hardware design.
Why isn't the firmware? Why is that not programmable as firmware?
This is the This is the Fadu unique thing, having our own control plane that's pipelined.
Okay, so it's that really. Yeah.
So in this one, you've hardware accelerated all the NVMe commands, everything's great, but a new NVMe feature come out. OCP changed the spec from 2.0 to 2.5. I guess we can't support the new spec because
and what about
we can't change it.
No mention of FPGAs in this conversation.
No, these are all ASICs.
So FPGA is no good.
FPGA is like and the really highly scale, like flexible and programmable, but very, very bad in power efficiency and performance scalability, right? Compare. I mean, I guess maybe the worst is the cost part, right? If FPGAs were super cheap, then and power efficient, then it would, like Fusion IO and stuff did that for a long time, right? So it works when you're in this like boutique market, but not like at scale where we're shipping millions of units. Okay, so that was the best I could do about kind of explaining the architecture. It's well, we'll just leave you with, it's very different than other SSD designs. That was the thing that kind of blew my mind. It was like, it's very, very different from what everybody else is doing. Yeah. Okay. So, products. So, I mean, you guys have seen a bunch of SSDs. This shouldn't be like too shocking to you. These are, these nice, pretty pictures of our SSDs. Oh wow, this is like, I didn't even know it was animated here, so that's not good because I was messing with it. Apparently this slide is animated. Great. Oh no. No. Okay, how do I stop it from?
We still have 50 minutes. You can slow down a little.
Oh no, we've got plenty of slides. Yeah, don't even worry. This is the pipeline presentation.
Next time I need to give you something before you start presenting.
Another espresso here. Okay, let me see if I can turn off this stupid animation.
I think you need to feed a scrub.
Duration. Oh, on mouse click. Yeah, I don't want to.
We need it.
It's this. Yeah, it's this European espresso, guys.
I'm from New York.
All right. So, the roadmap. This is kind of like the cartoon public version of the roadmap.
Is this public?
Yeah, everything here is public. Yeah, we've announced. So the big news, I just mentioned the first SSD was actually this Gen 3 drive, which, funny enough, this Gen 3 drive is still shipping. We use the M.2 as a boot drive for a bunch of hyperscalers. They really like this M.2 as a boot drive, so they're still shipping that. The PCIe 4, I mentioned we have a few customers still shipping that, but we're trying to like aggressively end of life it because the Gen 5 controller is awesome. And the Gen 5 controller, you can do everything the Gen 4 controller does at lower power. So I have a ton of details about the controller here in a few slides, so I won't. But we have an E1.S that launched in, it was, let's see, it's 2024 now. It was shipping in high volume kind of when I joined earlier. I joined about a year ago. And the E3.S and U.2 that we have two flavors of that. So I mentioned one with the SKV7 NAND and one with the WD-BIC6, and then the one that we actually shipped through the partner, WD SNA61. They're shipping the E1.S to a major hyperscaler at scale today. Volume shipments in like tens of thousands of units in Q4, and then they're expanding the E3.S and U.2 versions like kind of later in early Q1. And then we have some stuff planned with our partners in 2025 to do higher cap drives. So right now, shipping in high volume is 2, 4, and 8 terabytes, and then 16 terabytes going to be like early Q1 of 25. And then basically you have to switch to a 1 terabit die. Sure. We are going to be looking at partners. I'll talk about our kind of what our controller can do. We are planning the QLC stuff right now, but yeah, it's exciting. Big drives coming out. Yes.
Can we get an idea of the size of the company shipments? How much is? Because it's still very esoteric stuff. Also, tell us how many. I mean, okay, so you might have a company called Meta. You didn't say.
Possibly, yeah.
How many controller units do you ship every year?
Well, I could say for any of that stuff, since it is a publicly traded company, I'll have to defer to whatever we said in our last earnings thing. But yeah, I can tell you that they're ramping right now in production. We have a drive that's completed a hyperscale qual in both NANDs, and which is kind of a first also for a company. And yeah, shipping in high volume today in Q4. So I think that's consistent with what we've announced publicly. So Chris, you asked about QLC. Yeah, we're not shipping anything on QLC right now. It's kind of interesting. I mentioned back to that business model thing. Right now the company has a controller business model, which the only way to sell more controllers is to sell more drives. So like shipping these like really high capacity drives is actually kind of bad for a controller company. You're like, no, I want to ship more of the smaller ones. But so they're working through our partners to figure those kind of deals out. So besides that, I'll share with you two other interesting products that we have on the roadmap. One that's not really on here, but we actually do design our own PMIC, which is a power management IC that goes on the drive that handles stuff like power loss protection and the regulation from the input voltage down to the voltage on the controller. And shockingly, all the PMICs out there on the market kind of suck. They're like 80-85% efficiency. So we built one that's 95% efficiency. And we didn't really know that other SSD vendors wanted it until we kind of just talked about it publicly, and everybody's like, wait, what? We'll buy that. So we're actually looking at maybe productizing and selling the power management IC just by itself. And then we have a subsidiary of the company called EM, and they're based out of Campbell in California, and they are doing the CXL development. So they have a CXL switch and kind of a memory subsystem stuff that they're planning. I'm not going to talk much about that stuff today because we kind of have it separated in two different companies so they can focus on the CXL stuff. Yeah.
Does water cooling and the shift to that in the data center change what's going to be required in terms of thermal dissipation and capabilities on these drives?
It's a great question. I mean, at least in the Blackwell designs, the drives are still air-cooled, right? They have the liquid cold plate on the GPU, and then the drives still have the fans moving the air through. So immersion cooling is obviously different, where everything's just submerged, and then you could probably, the difference of like 5 watts or 10 watts is not a big deal in something like that. But when we get to the Gen 6 section, that will be very important because that's where the power, the NAND conversation gets very, very, very interesting. So.
And that's where we see 100% direct die coverage, including memory DIMMs.
Yeah, it's all kinds of. It's almost hard to keep up to date. Like I was at the OCP Global Summit, and you're looking at all these crazy, liquid cooling designs and cold. It's just like even somebody who's been in a data center world for my whole career, just like, oh my god, this is insane! Like all the new stuff. So, Yeah, I imagine it's very hard to, but yeah, immersion cooling and liquid cooling are obviously two major trends in data center power efficiency.
Well, I'd say immersion less so. Direct
Yeah,
to chip liquid cooling is where
Yeah.
most of the action is.
yeah. So this is like the marketing cartoon of all the good stuff, right? But I mentioned we have this 16-channel controller. Something I kind of forgot to mention on the controller stuff is it's a 16-channel controller, but it's only a 19mm package. So we're able to do that same controller on E1.S, E3.S, and U.2. All form factors perfectly fine, fits on all of them in the power envelope. The controller itself is only 5.7 watts active, which is significantly less than I mentioned like the Marvell and Microchip ones. They have public spec sheets. Their Gen 5 controllers are 10 watts, so almost half power.
We're seeing a lot of drives with 20 watt active power.
Yeah. So yeah, having a controller, and you'll see when you get to the power efficiency, like how big a deal that makes. I think we're at 45 minutes in. Oh man, wow. Okay, we're cruising. Yeah, so Gen 5 performance is great, on par with the best-in-class drives. Power efficiency we're going to talk about up to 50% better than, I think when I made this slide, we were comparing the Samsung Gen 5 drive. That was like one of the only ones out. And I'll talk about some of the features. Most important feature I'm going to talk about is FTP. And then reliability, security, all this standard stuff in enterprise drives. And then this I'll touch on. I have a few slides just to show you kind of where we're at competitively with quality of service in mixed reason writes, because this is where that pipelined architecture really, really helps. So this is, again, like the speeds and feeds slides of the controller. Probably way, way, way too much information for you guys, but see what's important. Lots of namespaces and queue pairs. We support all the virtualization features, end-to-end data protection, ECC on SRAM, PCIe, AR. I talked about the CBR core architectures, NAND 16-channel controllers, up to ONP 5.0 up to 2.4 gigatransfer per second. We support SLC, TLC, and QLC. So,
Are people putting your controllers in front of the QLC?
we have one partner that's working on that. Yes. But yeah, nothing that's shipping.
I'm just
shipping
assuming that if your controller is probably sophisticated and more expensive, why waste it on cheap QLC flash?
It's kind of interesting. It's with the QLC, it's different where you can actually use a more expensive controller and it doesn't matter as much because you have a unit cost of like these 120 terabyte drives are like 14, 15 grand, right? So a $70 controller versus a $40 controller, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? On a 2 terabyte drive, that's the difference between being profitable and not profitable, right? So it's on the bigger QLCs where you can afford these, like, we'll just say less efficient controller designs.
That's what I mean. Sorry, so that's it. So why would you put
Well, to manage QLC,
Yeah,
it's
it's
very tough. You need a more intelligent controller that enables you to use QLC.
So you would be at an advantage.
Yeah, basically you just have to support different LDCP sizes. They have different ECC sizes for the pages, and the controller supports all the QLC ones that are on their market today. I think it's like 480 byte ECC size or something for like most of the QLC stuff. So the nobody shipping it today is really just I mentioned the first traction we really had is this AI market with the hyperscalers, is where we have this compute high performance low latency drive.
You can share these slides afterwards.
Yeah, I don't think anything is in here that's like super confidential. I mean, I have some slides that are like pretty deep in performance. Might be a little bit too much, but yeah, I think I shouldn't have any problem sharing any. So this is our I don't know. Fadu rates the SSD performance kind of same end of life, worst case, guaranteed performance. So these are those numbers. 13.5 gigabytes a second, 8.8 gigabytes second sequential write, 3.1 million IFs random read. If you're at beginning of life, it's more like 14 gigabytes a second, 9.1 gigabytes a second, and 3.3 million IFs.
Did I misunderstand you when I thought you said that you don't sell many full SSDs yourself?
We don't. This is the product family. Yeah, we do have them. It is a fully supported product line that we support.
How many of these have you sold?
It's like tens of thousands, right? It's not like it's not like the hundreds of thousands kind of thing. Yeah. It's but I mentioned the controllers where we're trying to go to the millions of units through partners. So yeah, standard things you kind of expect on an enterprise, a competitive PCIe Gen 5 SSD. There's a lot of good drives out there. I mean, that Solidigm one, the D7 PS1010 or whatever they're calling it with SK Hynix, that one's good. The Micron's got the 9550 or whatever it is. So all the new Gen 5 drives are like very competitive. So, so the one thing we have, I mentioned, if everybody kind of has the same performance and same set of base features, this slide will be very, very important when we talk about AI. So one of the major AI use cases for RAG and GNN training is this GPU initiated storage, and I'll talk about my conversations I had with NVIDIA at a couple weeks ago on this, which is very interesting. But they want really, really good quality service, even like the worst case, 8 nines quality of service on a full random read. And this is so they can do hardware offload of basically from GPU VRAM to SSD directly. And they need this really, really consistent latency of random read. So we can go all the way up to I think queued up 512 at 800 microseconds random read at 8 nines, and then 1 9, so 99.9% under 200 milliseconds. So sorry, 200 microseconds. And this is pretty impressive, right? This is at 3.1 million IOPS, we can deliver 700 microsecond worst case latency. And when you map this versus the competition, these are just some. Sorry, Cameron, close your eyes here. This is what they picked. Well, I guess we have these in our lab here. The Samsung PM1743, CM7R, and then the Memblaze. Which, by the way, this Memblaze drive is this is a pretty good drive. This is using the Micron Gen 8 TLC, eTLC, which is very, very efficient. But you can see here, this Fadu is down here. In the latency, and other guys are spiking up to over 3 milliseconds in kind of this worst case, just for something as simple as a random read. Now, when you're doing this random read, a lot of the worst case will just be error recovery or stuff like that. So, all right, I know these are way too much detail. Just takeaway is very, very good quality service. Trust us. So this is the same thing on a mixed workload, just kind of orders of magnitude better than some of the competition out there. Okay.
So why's the competition still in business if your orders of magnitude better?
Well, nobody knows about us. That's why I'm here, right?
So yeah, actually, could you tell us about people that you have in France or Europe, for example, HR, people that are selling these solutions?
Oh, customers. Not a bunch in Europe right now, which is what.
Channel, I think our friend was asking about Channel.
Channel, yeah. No, not a bunch of Channel in the EU. Our sales teams, we've got now we got some sales guys in Taiwan and PRC, and obviously in the US, and then we have a sales guy in India. I don't think we have a sales guy out here yet. So this is part of the reason I'm here is to kind of just talk about what do we should we be selling out here? Probably. Obviously, WD is kind of global, right? They sell everywhere, so that's easy. Just go with them, and we kind of get a lot of coverage there.
How come you haven't gone for your own direct? So you've got this OEM market.
Yeah.
You've got the controller market. You sell.
It's
SSDs other people rebrand.
Yeah, this is me just talking as a longtime SSD product manager. This market is insanely competitive. Okay. You have Solidigm, SK Hynix, Kioxia, WD, Micron, none of these guys are bad competitors. Everybody's very, very qualified and competent.
But according to these graphs, your drives out.
So the other key part about being an SSD vendor for long term is being able to spend billions of dollars of capex on NAND, right? So obviously, as a fabulous company, we can't really we don't have billions of dollars of fabs for memory. So we have a partner, so we have to go through these partners. And so
so what does somebody buy? buy you if we use.
That would be a great idea.
That may
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether I'm asking questions that everybody else knows the answer
No,
to.
these are the business questions we talk about all the time, right? About like,
Because
okay,
some of those are business
right? Should we
questions.
scale? Should we scale with these large
Yeah.
OEMs? Should we scale with the NAND vendors directly? But then what happens if we, if they end up shipping like most of the volume? Then, like you said, like it makes sense for them just to buy us instead of like paying us. And that's I think why you'll see like some of the differentiation on the roadmap of like CXL and kind of more solution stuff that we're kind of looking at in the future, not just eSSD. eSSD obviously is like 99% of the business today, of course. But these are like really hard business questions to answer. Of like, it's a really tough market. Being a control, even having the best controller in the world is still a tough market because you're at behold
Can
of.
I ask another question?
Sure.
I'm just going to. I don't know whether other people already know the answer to the question, so I'm.
You asking questions I'd like to ask before I could ask them. So
Okay,
please
fine.
do.
We've got plenty of time anyway. What did you mean by you'd have to have billions of dollars up front to buy the NAND? I thought that if you wanted to make drives, hey, we make brilliant controllers, we'd like to buy some flash. Dear SK Hynix or dear Samsung, we'd like to buy some flash chips from you so we can make our own drives and sell those branded as.
You got it. Yeah, in a normal.
So where is this billion?
Yeah, in a normal balanced market,
that's
the way things operate. But like right now, when the demand for flash is higher than the supply,
so
you'd say, "Hey, SK, I'd like to buy some NAND." They're like, "That's great. We sold it all to Apple."
Okay. So you just can't.
You're like, "Can we pretty please have some NAND?" And so it's challenging. It's really just a supply and operations supply chain thing. It's like in the other side of the market, right, where it's very good when the NAND market dropped, it was in free fall, and all these guys were losing $1 billion of opportunity.
We go from oversupply to one.
Yeah, and that market, this model is really great because you're like, okay, we don't have these multi-billion-dollar fabs and billions of dollars of capex in operating margin that we're losing every quarter. We can just buy flash and then either hold on to it for a couple of months and then sell it, or make SSDs and sell it for a 30% margin, whatever. So certainly like it ebbs and flows with the market, but in this peak of the market, and there are some people that think, looking at the AI market for the next 5 years and the build out and the capex spend, if the models keep scaling, they're going to keep spending more money on capex for more AI hardware. It could typically this NAND market is like a 2 year kind of thing, but it could be a lot longer. It could be a lot longer of a up market and undersupply. Because if you think about like Samsung and SK Hynix, like they moved a lot of their capex to high bandwidth memory. They're not spending that money on fabs for NAND. And so if the NAND market continues growing, and then you have undersupply, it could be like a 4 year undersupply. We don't know. Who knows?
Much longer than we have before.
Maybe potentially longer than the NAND industry's ever endured, for sure. So these are all great questions.
Is this stuff coming through Taiwan as well as South Korea? Politically, if the world falls apart in the next couple of years, are you worried by the fact that China might take...
Yeah, these are great conversations over some beers. We'll just tell you, to get the Micron data sheet for the NAND, I had to sign a lot of papers saying that we will not ship anything into China.
Yeah.
We had to sign a lot of papers that say and Russia and all the other countries. So it's certainly challenging to support multiple geos at the same drive now because of all this complexity. So okay.
We're getting a much more protectionist America appearing, so
Oh my God.
there's going to be more sort of high tariffs and don't shoot to China.
Right. How are we doing on time? How long do we have to?
29 minutes.
Oh, okay. That's not so bad.
Yes, you can actually slow down.
Oh no, I'm on slide 26 of 67.
At this rate, downstairs, and we got all saying, goodness.
I know everybody's like tired and wants a beer. I mean, you guys can grab a beer while I present. I don't care. That's fine.
It's more about trying to understand what you're saying. I'm sorry for being blunt, but many of us are technical, and you're giving good information, but none of us are taking it in.
Well, I think you're being unfair, Ben. People are taking it in, but maybe they're not retaining it very well.
Fair enough. That's
okay,
fair.
yeah.
That's a much better way of putting it. Thank you. Yeah.
Because it's difficult for some. I mean, I'm not taking it in PR. But,
Yeah.
you know,
So let me see if I can do the best to summarize. So we have an NVMe SSD controller design that's very, very different from the competitors and everything that's out there. It happens to be a lot more power efficient, which is really important for AI, and it's really important for scaling when you go from PCIe Gen 5 to Gen 6. And those are some of the key concepts we're going to talk about today. Just like, how do you build a really good controller that scales? And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's, yeah, all the business stuff is like, it might change, you know, that's a much more nuanced conversation that, yeah.
Well, that's what we want to know as well, though, by the way.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and it doesn't require so
Fred
much
for
esoteric.
correcting you, much better way of putting it, yeah.
Sure, and
I mean, I don't understand how I know from your graph when it said QD, I know that's Q depth, and I know the Q depth affects latency, but I don't really know anything more than that, but at least I can understand.
Sure.
I want to learn something about Fadu. I ask business questions, at least I can understand.
for sure, yeah. And the business stuff I mentioned, like, you have two main NAND partners, most of our business today, one big hyperscaler, the majority of it. You know, we're kind of going into some other big enterprise OEMs. But yeah, we're still an enterprise SSD company. We're trying to get into, okay, do we become an SSD company? Well, you can make a lot more revenue as an SSD company, but you know, maybe the margins aren't as, you can't scale as big as you can scale. You know, with these other guys, if they're shipping to these hyperscalers and AI continues to go at the scale that they're going, it's millions and millions of units. You know, so it's a hard, you know, place to be from the business side. And that's you know, it's funny. I actually have lots of opinions on the business side, but the way the Korean business works is they just don't care. I'm just the American guy. Like, yeah, whatever. No, we'll talk about this in Korea. Don't worry about it.
Looking at your website, there's no investor material in any language.
In English, yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so this is the only slide I'll talk about. We do have another product called the Power Management IC.
the power of. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, Power Management IC. And basically it handles the power loss protection. So if you yank the drive from the server, make sure you don't lose data. And it handles making sure the power that comes into the connector gets delivered to all the components. And most of the power PMICs on the market are like 80-85% efficiency. So we built one that's 95% efficiency. And turns out this matters a whole lot in Gen 5 and Gen 6. Like 5 watts is a very, very large amount of power. So this will come in handy in here in a few slides. Okay. So
do you have any white papers on the technology of this that you can share with us?
oh yeah, we've got I'm trying my best to write some blog posts for the Fadu blog, and that's English only. Don't worry. And that's where a lot of this stuff will go. I'm writing one on the architecture right now. I've got one on power efficiency, and I've got one on flexible data placement.
So can you give us some references to these, along with the slides?
Yeah, of course, yeah, for sure.
Because I think that's how you take the stuff in. Is
Yeah.
To go
And I did record. I recorded a couple of my talks from FMS last year. We do have a YouTube. I know there's like a couple things up there.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
I've got PCIe Gen 5 SSD in my PC at home. 4 terabyte core cell one. It's a consumer drive.
Yeah, they're all garbage.
It's got quite a lot of controller in it. And I took that heatsink off it, and it was hitting 85, 90 degrees under load, and immediately throttling, and you touch it, and it burns your finger off.
Yeah.
Are Fadu controllers more efficient?
Oh.
Are they going to? Do you have to use it with the heatsink to get the full?
Well, and all the enterprise drives have heatsinks, right? So yeah, they.
That's no standard.
Yeah.
So that's a Fadu controller on a consumer drive.
Yeah, we don't have any consumer SSD. We thought about doing consumer
But
SSD.
Orestes says it has.
Yeah.
I've got a final controller.
Yeah, it's just a consumer drive. That's a
With
toy.
a Fadu
Well, this
controller.
is actually a good place to talk about this, right? So, I mean, maybe this is not obvious, but it's really obvious to me. A consumer SSD and a data center SSD are they're in different universes. They actually don't share almost anything. Like the consumer SSD controller. I mean, these are like 512 gigs, 1 terabyte. You know, this controller has to be $3. If it's even $4,
Oh, you're so
it's garbage.
dismissive. You're a snob.
Right, right. So now the way power efficiency works in the consumer space is your laptop here sits here with my PowerPoint presentation. The drive sits there idle 99% of the time. So if you're optimizing for power efficiency, you say, how do I reduce the power when the thing's idle? and then how to make it so when it comes back from idle that it's very low latency, that the person doesn't see like a blip or a lag when they come back. So consumer SSDs have gotten very, very good at this. You can do 5 milliwatts idle power and resume from latency from almost zero idle power in under 100 microseconds, or sorry, 100 milliseconds. Some of them at like 10 milliseconds. This is really, really good. So 10 milliseconds in the data center is catastrophic. 10 milliseconds latency for an SSD would be terrible, right? The latency of SSDs is like microseconds, right? So this technology doesn't work it works in laptops, does not work in data centers. So when you talk about power efficiency on a consumer drive, it's about battery life. What's the idle power? How fast does it come back? What's the battery life of that thing? When you talk about power efficiency of a data center drive, you talk about performance per watt. And this is a really big metric in obviously CPUs and GPUs, like performance per watt. How much performance can you deliver at a certain power? And that is the metric of goodness for power efficiency in an SSD. Probably can't read any of this, but I'll just ignore that and listen to what I'm saying here. NVMe has this really cool thing called power states. So I can take a 25 watt drive and just say, hey, drive, you are now a 20 watt drive. Or hey, drive, you are now a 15 watt drive. And the drive will never consume more than that power. This is really, really handy. And I'll talk about the use cases. The hyperscaler guys, they use this all the time. And this is just the actual way to do that in NVMe.
Okay.
Yeah.
I said I'm not technical, but if you have multiple drives, can you slow one down instead of another, or do you have to use them as a block?
Oh yeah, this is at an individual drive level. Okay. But typically, maybe you have a power budget for a server and say, okay, well we have 24 drives in this server. And I'll give you an example of this here in a few slides. And say, okay, well 24 times 25, that's a lot of power. Okay, what if we actually just reduce the power by 10 watts each? Okay, well that's 240 watt reduction on a single server. That's a big deal, right? That could be 20%. So
but you lose performance, don't you?
You do, and so that is an amazing question. So you lose performance. How much performance do you lose when you cap the drive? Well, it's actually a function of, okay, this is kind of a simplified cartoon, but imagine, okay, you have 16 watts, and our controller is 5.7 watts, and then you say, okay, at 16 watts, you can give 5.7 watts to the controller, and then the rest of the NAND, 65%. So if you were to compare that versus like the Samsung controllers, like 8.5 watts, I mentioned the Marvell and microchip ones are like 10 watts. If you cap that same drive to 16 watts, well, you only get 47% of the power to the NAND. So your performance per watt, it doesn't go down a little bit, it goes down a lot. Our performance reduction is maybe 10-15%, where theirs is like 40% reduction. And this concept of like, okay, well, I'll illustrate here in a few slides, like why you want to actually do that. Why would you want to reduce the power? But this metric of goodness, which is like power efficiency, which is what is your IOPS per watt or megabytes per second per watt, Fadu's like 49% higher than the competition. So this one, I did write a whole blog on this and have a bunch of good information, so I'll send that over. But
so I have a business question for you.
Sure.
Who are you, sum up who you want to sell to? Are you looking for end user customers to demand Fadu powered devices? Are you selling primarily to OEMs? I mean, that and hyperscalers are there. We see that.
I'd say our number one target customer would be like the NAND vendors. To say, hey, could you use Fadu controller in your roadmap instead of whatever controller you have? A lot of these guys have internal controller designs. Some of them use external controllers. Okay. Our competitors, would be, I mentioned Marvell. They are kind of dropping out of the SSD market after the Gen 5 one. At least they kind of publicly said something like that.
Fair enough. And as journalists and analysts here, how should we position what we write about you? And who should our audience be?
Yeah, I understand your question here, because if we're selling to these guys, you're like, why does the end user actually care?
Well, some of us write for the customers you want, right? As analysts, we look at that. Sure. But who should we be writing to? or analyzing?
Yeah.
For?
As you've,
Sorry,
have you,
that was a terrible question.
no, I mean, as you've seen,
And you say that you can't understand what JS is.
I'll just say,
No,
yeah,
I was just saying my question was framed terribly.
no, I mean, it's a fairly technical presentation today, I'm sure, and it's not,
And
doesn't
that's
help,
fine.
doesn't help that it's at the end of the day, I'm sure.
No,
But,
no,
no, I mean, like, it's a very small pool of people out there in SSD controller land. It's like,
Okay.
it's like us and ScaleFlux, from the enterprise side, Marvell, which I mentioned is kind of like questionable whether they're going to fund it in the future. Microchip, also questionable because everybody good at Microchip left.
I'm sure the CTO of a large company will be interested in these sort of figures because they're being constrained on being lean and using power efficiently and so on. And somebody comes along and says, well, buy stuff which has this Fadu controller in it, and it is going to be significantly more cost effective to get low power.
Yeah, let me see.
And that's my question. Like, is this an audience that you feel that we here should write to, so that CTOs, CIOs, CXOs should you want them to demand products that have Fadu in it, but then there's somebody else in the middle.
Mostly awareness, right? We have one big partner, WD, so getting some visibility into like, there's actually some.
So who are the other? Carry on with that list: Marvell, ScaleFlux, Microchip.
And then I mentioned, Phison and SMI have enterprise offerings, but they've never, as far as I understand, have made it through, hyperscale qual. So, there's only like 5 options, and I just mentioned, you can immediately cut 4 of those off the list because they've never completed a hyperscale qual.
And so, what do you think about the pure storage approach? Because what they say, they are trying to sell their technology to the hyperscaler.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a controller on their own SSD. Actually, it's a kind of
software controller.
Yeah.
And so, what they are telling me, it's the problem with the SSD solution, with the controller, and even with your approach, is you have a controller that needs RAM to work, to manage the data you put on the cell. And this is that RAM that consumes a lot of energy. And they say, we have in our operating system all the algorithm, that's why we don't need some RAM on the SSD, and that's why their SSD are twice.
So, interestingly enough, we do have a DRAM-less solution that we have, so we can use pooled. We do, and so that you can. There is another hyperscaler that builds their own SSDs that is looking at our product for that. And so our CXL team is actually building something kind of like what you described with Pure.
Okay.
Another funny trivia thing is the Pure Storage office is across the street from Fadu. Our office is in Santa Clara Square in California. And quite literally, the Pure Storage office is across the street.
And so you can spy, you can...
I've been over there a few times, yes.
But I mean, what they were telling me, they are making some tests at hyperscaler, so they didn't tell me if it was AWS, Azure, or on Google. Yeah. But to really sell that solution to manage all the flash storage in
I'll do my best. I don't even know if we're going to have time for the FTP talk, but
It's got 15 minutes, but then we've got time now.
We'll talk. What do you say? So there's a technology called flexible data placement that's been invented by Meta and Google mostly, but the way that Google uses it is kind of like how Pure does. They want to manage the flash, they want to manage the garbage collection, they want to do they're like, no, the drive sucks at that. Let us do it, and we can get the best WAF. And then a lot of the other vendors, they say, no, look, we have a lot more bigger things to worry about. We have AI, we have accelerators, we have GPUs. Like Flash is like, just give us the drive and make it work. Like just shut, So there's both ends of the spectrum. Like some guys will want to do everything, and what to say, like Google went that method with their own SSD, where they like own drive, they took an off-shelf controller, designed their own firmware, and it worked amazing for their thing. But they can only get one vendor that can do it. Now they're like, shoot, we can't. We want to scale. Like we can't get any more vendors, right? So they had to make it less complex. But okay, so.
I mean, the story I could see you writing is something about why a enterprise SSD is different to a consumer SSD. That's an interesting story for people.
Yeah.
And the fact that power efficiency is something you should be asking about.
Absolutely.
And that's really the capabilities of most CTOs.
Yeah, and this hopefully this slide kind of illustrates. I know it. Let's see if I can do my best here. So okay, here's a Supermicro server. It supports 24 SSDs. Each E1.SSD. We'll just say like let's pretend we have one that's Fadu that's 16 watts and some other competitor that's 25 watts. It's just a made up drive. Don't ask me. Okay. So if anybody has a 1U server, they know that there's these notoriously loud 40 millimeter fans. If you ever turned on a 1U server, very loud. You do not want this in your garage or anywhere close to anywhere you are. It's very loud. So if you just reduce the power, okay, 24 drives, 25 watts, 16 watts, that's 9 watts. Now multiply it by 24 drives, you can look at the power reduction. That's this pink right here. But the thing that's not obvious is when you run the drives at a lower power, the server will throttle to whatever the hottest component in the server is. And so if you run the drives at 25 watts, the fans will be at 100% speed. So if you run the fans lower, your fan speed actually goes from like 100% down to like 30%. And if you add up all that power, that's a 26% reduction in power by one small change. Just taking the drive from 25 watt to 16 watts. Very, very tiny change. But you're able to reduce the whole system power by 26%.
And there's a social aspect to this too, because I think companies are going to be expected to have a non-greenwashing story about being green. And this sort of thing means they can actually justify why they're choosing energy efficient technology, as opposed to just saying that they are. They've actually put some sort of reasons behind it, logic behind it. And I think that's going to help people at the upper end of just trying to prove that their story is not greenwashing.
Can you go over that chart again? Do you mind doing that because we've got the time?
Oh, for this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. Sorry. These are kind of.
So let me talk you through it because you go so far. You do go fast, and I'm struggling to this afternoon. So the server on the left hand side is a server fitted with a competitor's drive.
Yeah.
And the block on the right is a server fitted with a Fadu drive.
Yep.
The Fadu drive consumes 16 watts, whereas the competitor's drive consumes 25 watts.
Yep, you got it.
That is a 9 watt difference. Are you saying that this whole server only consumes 4 times 9 is 36? The whole server?
Yeah, so up here, this is the y-axis is power. So this would be almost 1,500 watts in a fully configured server.
So by reducing the power consumption of the drive by using a drive that consumes 9 watts less, you're gonna have to tell me again why is that 26?
Yeah, so you shrink. So this red stays the same, right? That's your DRAM, your CPUs, your NIC, the motherboard, all that stuff. None of that changes. The SSDs, you're reducing the power from 25 watts to 16 watts, so that shrinks. But the thing that people forget is that this one shrinks. This is the fans. I'm sorry, they're all kind of the same color.
On that graph, you've got the size of the SSD consuming the light pink arrow.
Oh yeah, it's a huge amount of power.
But it's only 9 watts. But on the right hand side, you've got the Fadu drive, 16 watts.
You've got 24 of them, right? So,
like I said, I'm not having a brilliantly smart.
Yeah, it's a couple hundred. It's this is like almost 500 watts.
Got it.
Right.
Got it. Sorry.
Right.
Thank you.
And so this is in a storage server. Makes sense that the storage is actually taking like 40% of the power, But so what I'm articulating here is exactly what Meta and other hyperscalers do. They run the drive at whatever the highest power that they can get away with, which meets their performance requirements, and that gets them the lowest TCO. So if they can run the fan speeds lower, that means less power to the fans, less cost for power, and better at cooling. So this next one is basically illustrating, okay, if I take that same example, 10 minutes left. Okay, well, I'm definitely not getting through the last topic, but it's
you better talk faster.
Yeah, I know, right? Okay. So if you pop all that into the SNIA TCO model, which is I mentioned is actually kind of ironically the most famous thing that I wrote in SNIA. I partnered with Microsoft and Meta and AWS, when I initially wrote that. But anyways, it's free and open source. Just go to TCO model. If you pop all that in the TCO model, and you look at just like in the TCO model, the important thing is TCO dollar per terabyte per month per rack. And by using that lower power SSD, you're able to reduce the TCO by 29%, which is actually huge.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's huge, right? This is one change, just one power change in the drive. So this is now, okay, we've got one,
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Small change, big impact is the outcome.
I mean, so this would be the hidden monster, the hidden dollar-eating monster in the data center.
Now, the good thing is that OCP is actually starting to talk about how to measure this efficiency. A lot of companies, you mentioned the greenwashing. In the US, it's very bad. I don't think that almost anybody in the ICT industry actually understands what sustainability is. They say sustainability when they mean energy efficiency. And I just mentioned like energy efficiency is one very important topic of sustainability, but it is not a sustainability strategy. But the OCP has this new thing called infrastructure utilization efficiency, which is basically looking at a rack and saying, okay, how much useful power is going in there, computational, and how much do we lose from idle, power conversion loss, thermal. And it turns out, like in a standard rack, almost 40% of the energy is wasted, meaning it's not doing useful stuff. It's wasted on fans, it's wasted on thermal loss, it's wasted on idle power. So now we have a way, so typically if you guys know about, are you guys familiar with like PUE in data centers?
Yep.
Yeah. So PUE would be measuring at the data center level, like the cooling and overhead at the data center level. But as far as the servers in the rack, well, those are just servers in the rack. But it turns out there's a lot of wasted power in the servers because of fans and other stuff. Not a small amount, it's like almost 40%. So now we have a new metric to basically quantify this. So energy efficiency is something you can measure, performance per watt. It's something that impacts sustainability because it can lower the useful power in a life cycle assessment. It can lower the power in the use phase. And it's a key in what we call infrastructure utilization effectiveness.
But you want to collect all this information, observability, and bubble it up into an image that the managing director can look at and see how he's performing in terms of energy efficiency, whatever, sustainability, whatever he wants to measure, and then dig down those things into the hard facts. So you can call in one of his storage experts and say, this thing tells me that we're wasting a lot of energy in our data center.
Yeah.
Can you sort of dig down this while I'm looking over your shoulder? And that way you get the greenwashing goes away because
it's very cool. So I mentioned I do quite a bit of work in the sustainability space. That's completely outside Fadu for the most part. I chair an OCP work group called Carbon Accounting and Circularity, where we're looking at like actual reporting standards for circularity and how they would impact greenhouse gas reporting. And then the other part is the circularity project. We're talking about media sanitization, driver use.
You must have the drill down.
Yeah.
So that the real hard information.
Yeah, there's a really cool thing in
in
OCP. Redfish can actually enumerate the power in the server, and it can enumerate the power of the fans as well.
Yeah.
So you can have an automated way to see like how efficient are your servers running. It's very, very cool.
Somebody should be selling that. Is somebody selling that stuff in a?
Yeah, there's some stuff about sustainability. Okay, so I have 5 minutes left. I had storage and AI, which I'm sure you guys have probably talked about a lot today, and FTP. I might swap to FTP, but we can come back to storage and AI at some point because I like talking about AI. But or Gen 6. Oh my gosh, we have Gen 6 too. Oh gosh.
We could do a Zoom call afterwards.
All right, I think we're gonna go Gen 6, and then maybe 5 minutes of FTP. I'm gonna go fast. Okay. All right, we ready? Okay. Okay, so Gen 6 controller. So that's my day job is working on this thing.
We could record this and play it back at half speed.
I usually play stuff at 2x speed, which is probably my problem. So Gen 6 is pretty nuts. We're talking about 28 gigabytes a second on a single drive. And we don't have more power, right? The drives have to kind of stay in the same power. And I get a lot of questions on like, why the hell do we need Gen 6? That seems way too fast for an SSD. Is this what, by the way, this is the same question Cameron and I answered a million times of like, why do you need NVMe over SATA? People are like, SATA's plenty good. You don't need NVMe. Well, they're wrong. You definitely need Gen 6. It's definitely twice as fast as Gen 5.
You always need more speed.
You always need more speed. And it's PCIe SIG is not stopping at Gen 6. They actually have a plan for Gen 7. And by the way, NVIDIA has already said that the Rubin product line is going to support PCIe.
Gen 6, you're not doubling the performance. I mean, power.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the problem. You've doubled the performance requirement, but you have not doubled the power. And so now we're left with the conundrum of like, what do we do? Well, turns out if you have an energy efficient controller that scales very well, that will do very well. But this is the why do you need Gen 6? It's for AI, 100%. Like AI workloads need lots of bandwidth. They need lots of IOPS. And I have another slide in here about NVIDIA Scala, which is one of the new technologies NVIDIA has for the GPU direct storage. I spent a lot of time talking to NVIDIA architects about this, but just take my word for it. AI needs Gen 6 and they need very fast storage. So we designed a drive that can do full Gen 6 performance, it's greater than 28 gigabytes a second, and that's sequential read and write. It can do 6.9 million IOPS in a single drive. It has FTP, and then the power efficiency I mentioned, we can do 2 gigabytes per second per watt, which will be absolutely best in class, and support all the latest fancy new features in virtualization, OCP, and security. The security is the big one where generation over generation, this is where we see the biggest change in SSD controller architecture. Is like there's a lot of new security requirements for confidential computing, quantum safe crypto, harder roots of trust. There's a ton of work, especially it's going on from the coming from the hyperscalers directly. So, okay, so basically, there's almost no SSD vendor I mentioned just because of the way that the controller architecture works. With like, if you want to double the performance, you're usually going to have to add more stuff, more ARM cores, more power. We can basically double the performance with just a litho change, basically 2xing the performance and at a very similar power that we have on the Gen 5 drive. So we're able to do 2x performance and 2x the energy efficiency on, this is a sequential read, which is just mind-blowing. So lots more to talk about there, I'm sure, over beers, but this is what we've publicly announced on Gen 6. We have a Gen 6 controller. It's going to max out Gen 6 performance. It's going to be around the same power as our Gen 5 drive, which is insane.
So it seems that what you mean is marketing. I mean, if you're doing all this great stuff and nobody knows about you, there's something wrong with your marketing, sure.
What marketing? I'm the product guy. I don't know. There's no marketing here. Oh, this one might be animated too. Okay, cool. Well, I'm gonna have like the 2-minute version of FTP because I have.
Yeah,
oh, cool.
2 minutes, that's fine.
Okay. So, how many people know what Write Amplification Factor is? Oh god. Okay.
So again, what?
Write Amplification Factor. Okay. 2. Has anybody heard of SSD garbage collection? Okay, a few more. How about trim? Okay, we got a couple more. Okay, these are all related. It's basically like, how do you make the SSD more efficient when you write data that it only writes the actual data that you needed and not other data that was written to move data around. So this idea of garbage collection, all SSDs use NAND flash, pretty much, and NAND flash is amazing, but it has one downside. When you write to NAND flash, the block has to be erased before you program it. And you erase in blocks, but you program in pages. So a block is thousands of pages. So you have this problem. You want to go, the SSD is full, you want to go write data to it, you're like, shoot, I can't write data because there's no room. I have to use this over provisioning to write the data to, and then go look back at the good data and say, I need to now go do garbage collection on that data. So there's a feature that NVMe has called flexible data placement. It basically just says, when you're writing the data, tell the drive a little bit about where you want the data, like whether so they have these things called reclaim unit handles or placement groups. Basically, it's an idea of like, you're giving the drive hints about what data goes with what data, and then the drive can do firmware in this new feature to basically organize that data into different places to make it more efficient. And this is, I mentioned, primarily driven by Google and Meta, and we're one of the first drives to support it in production.
I did something about this years and years ago on the mainframes with VSAM, and it's data dependent. It was trying to place the data on the drive so you could actually expand quickly. and with certain data patterns, it used up all the free space, so you could end up with a drive that was half empty.
Yep.
Only a bit of it was usable. And it seems to be this could happen here too. If you're starting to move things around and optimize the placement, if the data you're writing doesn't fit the averages well, you end up all trying to hit the same spot in the disk. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and the way this is measured in SSD world, I mentioned it's called this thing called Write Amplification Factor. But think of this as like how efficient is your SSD at writing data? If you have a 1, if that number is 1, that means for every bit of data I gave the host gave the drive only had to write it once.
So does FTP reduce the write amplification factor?
That is the number one thing it does. And what it does.
Well done, Tim.
Yes. And so exactly why that is so powerful. Okay, so say you go from a WAF of 2 to a WAF of 1, you've doubled the performance, you've doubled the energy efficiency, and you've doubled half your cost, 50% reduction. Sorry, 100% reduction, 50% of your cost. So you've improved your TCO by 50%. So just going from a WAF of 2 to 1. And in databases, it's very typical for an SSD to have a WAF of like 2 to 3. So again, this is like when I was at Intel and I had interns that were starting, I would take them to a whiteboard. The first thing I would do is say, "You're going to learn about WAF." And literally SSD 101. Okay, what is an SSD? What is flash? What is garbage collection? What is after they understood that, all this made sense because it's all that. The only thing you ever have to understand about SSD is this idea of write amplification factor. Everything else kind of makes sense around it. But this one change, this new feature, allows you to enhance performance, improved endurance, reduced over provisioning, which helps you with TCO, and improve quality service. And yeah, I have literally there's 20 slides on FTP, but this is like the one slide here.
So my question is, how resilient is this for different data patterns? Does it depend on particular data profile being consistent?
Yeah.
But does it always work? Or does it sometimes go wrong?
That was my topic of my presentation this year at Class Member Summit, which was how do you use multiple namespaces? And the idea is pretty easy. Basically, you have an 8 terabyte drive. Let's just take that 8 terabyte drive and split it into 8 1 terabyte namespaces, and each VM gets one of those namespaces, and then they're all completely isolated, and they can work independent from each other. And it turns out my experiment worked, and it was very wildly successful.